The pharmacy security footage that would eventually be entered as evidence in federal court showed Margaret Maggie Sullivan's assault in brutal detail across 4 camera angles. The 65-year-old retired hospice nurse entering CVS Pharmacy on J Street in Sacramento at 2:34 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon to pick up her insulin prescription and diabetes medication, having no indication that she'd been specifically targeted for elimination by people who'd decided her witness testimony about pharmaceutical corruption was too dangerous to allow. Ramon El Lobo Castillo and 3 Grey Wolves cartel sicarios had been waiting in the parking lot for 47 minutes, their presence timed precisely to Maggie's pharmacy pickup schedule that they'd obtained through sources they believed were reliable. Their mission being to stage what would appear as random robbery gone wrong, but was actually coordinated assassination of elderly witness who'd documented systematic medical fraud and patient deaths. The assault happened in the medication pickup area at 2:41 p.m. when Ramon approached Maggie from behind while she waited for her prescription, his hand grabbing her shoulder with force that spun her around, his voice loud enough that the 3 other customers and 2 pharmacy staff could hear every word. "Margaret Sullivan, you have something that belongs to us. Medical records, patient files, documentation about prescription patterns. You're going to give us everything you've collected about Dr. Adrian Wolf's clinics, and you're going to forget you ever saw patterns in how elderly patients were being prescribed opioids. This is your only warning." Maggie's response revealed both her 37 years as hospice nurse accustomed to dealing with difficult patients and families, and her fundamental refusal to be intimidated when she knew she was right about patient care being corrupted for profit. "Young man, I don't know who you are, or who sent you, but I reported what I found through proper channels. 47 elderly patients died from opioid overdoses prescribed by Dr. Wolf's clinics in 18 months. That's not coincidence. It's systematic patient abuse designed to create addicts who generate ongoing revenue until they overdose. I'm not giving you anything, and I'm certainly not forgetting that people are dying for profit." Ramon's 3 associates moved to surround Maggie with practiced coordination, their positioning blocking her escape routes while maintaining appearance of random customer traffic that wouldn't immediately alert pharmacy staff that assault was imminent. What none of them had anticipated was that Maggie would fight back with the fierce determination of someone who'd spent decades advocating for vulnerable patients against medical systems that sometimes prioritized profit over care. Her first action was pressing the medical alert pendant she wore around her neck, a device her son Michael had insisted she carry after she'd started receiving threatening phone calls about her documentation of prescription fraud. Her second action was swinging her heavy purse with surprising force at the sicario, attempting to grab her from the left, the bag's contents including her medical files, a hardcover book, and various personal items creating improvised weapon that caught him across the face with enough impact to break his nose and force him back. If you're ready to witness how an assault on one retired hospice nurse triggered the largest coordinated protection campaign in motorcycle club history, how 1,500 bikers from 5 organizations provided round-the-clock security for 35 elderly witnesses that pharmaceutical criminals were systematically eliminating, and how the real story wasn't about cartel violence but about medical fraud that was killing vulnerable patients for profit while using organized crime to silence anyone who tried to expose it, hit that like button and subscribe because this story will take you into the darkest corners of pharmaceutical corruption, elder abuse through medical neglect, and the extraordinary power of communities organizing to protect their most vulnerable members when institutions designed to serve them have been completely perverted by corporate greed. The violence that followed Maggie's resistance lasted 23 seconds of brutal assault captured in devastating clarity by multiple security cameras, Ramon personally striking Maggie across the face to force her compliance, one sicario wresting her medical files from her grasp while another pushed her violently to the ground, the fall resulting in Maggie's left hip fracturing with audible crack that the pharmacy microphones recorded along with her scream of pain. They fled with her medical files and medication bag, leaving the 65-year-old woman bleeding and injured on the pharmacy floor while customers and staff stood frozen in shock at witnessing elderly woman being brutally assaulted in broad daylight in what was supposed to be safe commercial space. The 911 call came through at 2:44 p.m., the pharmacy manager's voice shaking. "I need ambulance at CVS on J Street. An elderly woman has been assaulted. She's bleeding from facial wounds and saying she can't feel her left leg. The attackers fled. Please hurry. She's in severe pain and I think her hip might be broken." Michael Axe Sullivan received the call from Sacramento Police Department at 3:07 p.m. while he was overseeing legitimate construction operations that the Angels had been developing as alternative revenue sources, the officer's voice carrying professional sympathy that immediately signaled something serious had occurred. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Officer Jennifer Martinez with Sacramento PD. Your mother, Margaret Sullivan, was assaulted at CVS Pharmacy approximately 25 minutes ago. She's being transported to UC Davis Medical Center with hip fracture and facial injuries. She's conscious and stable but in considerable pain. We need you to get to the hospital. And Mr. Sullivan, this wasn't random robbery. The attackers took her medical files and medications but left her wallet and jewelry. This appears to have been targeted assault specifically focused on documentation your mother had been collecting. We'll need to speak with you about potential motives and suspects once you've seen her condition." Michael felt cold fury building as he processed that his 65-year-old mother, a woman who'd dedicated her life to caring for dying patients with compassion and dignity, who'd raised him alone after his father's death when Michael was 14, who'd never asked him to use club resources to protect her despite knowing his position gave him access to that protection, had been specifically targeted and violently assaulted for trying to expose medical corruption that was killing vulnerable elderly patients. He called Robert Bishop Hayes immediately, his vice president's background as former paramedic making him the tactical coordinator for any situation involving medical crisis or elderly victim protection. "Bishop, my mother was assaulted at a pharmacy 30 minutes ago. They took her medical files documenting opioid prescription fraud. She has fractured hip and facial injuries. This was targeted elimination attempt disguised as robbery. I need you to get every available brother to UC Davis Medical Center immediately. I need comprehensive security around my mother's room, and I need you to start identifying who ordered this, who executed it, and everyone involved in the decision chain from whoever provided her schedule to whoever gave the order to assault a 65-year-old hospice nurse." Robert Bishop Hayes had lost his own mother to medical neglect 6 years earlier when understaffed nursing home had failed to properly monitor her medications, resulting in fatal drug interaction that proper oversight would have prevented. His personal experience with how vulnerable elderly patients were to systematic failures and deliberate abuse made him the club's most passionate advocate for protecting senior community members from predators who targeted them. "Axe, I'm mobilizing 20 brothers to the hospital immediately. But brother, if your mother was targeted for documenting pharmaceutical fraud, she's not the only elderly witness being eliminated. We need to identify every other person who has information about this scheme and provide them protection before they're similarly targeted. This isn't about avenging one assault. It's about preventing a systematic campaign to eliminate everyone who knows about medical corruption that's killing patients for profit." Dr. Elena Martinez had been Margaret Sullivan's primary care physician for 8 years, their relationship defined by mutual respect between medical professionals who prioritized patient welfare over bureaucratic efficiency or pharmaceutical industry pressure. When Maggie was admitted to UC Davis Medical Center at 3:23 p.m., Dr. Martinez immediately recognized the significance of her injuries and the theft of her medical files. "Maggie, I know what you've been documenting about Dr. Adrian Wolf's opioid prescription patterns. I've been collecting similar evidence from my own practice showing systematic overprescribing to elderly patients. You being assaulted, your files being stolen, this is exactly what Wolf does to anyone who threatens to expose his operation. In the past 18 months, 12 elderly witnesses or medical professionals who had evidence about his fraud have died in accidents or been assaulted severely enough that they withdrew their complaints. You're number 13. And the only reason you're alive is because you fought back and because your son happens to be Hell's Angels president. Maggie processed this information through the fog of pain medication, her nurse's training helping her maintain mental clarity despite the trauma. Dr. Martinez, if Wolf has eliminated 12 other witnesses, we need to warn anyone else who has information. We need to protect them before Wolf's people target them next. I documented 47 elderly patient deaths from opioid overdoses that were prescribed through Wolf's clinics. That's not the complete picture. That's just what I found through my hospice work and my own pharmacy records review. How many other healthcare workers have noticed the pattern? How many are at risk right now because they know too much about pharmaceutical fraud that's generating millions in profits while killing vulnerable patients? Agent Tom Baker had been investigating Dr. Adrian Wolf's pharmaceutical operations for 2 years, building case about systematic fraud that included unnecessary prescriptions, billing for services not rendered, and, most disturbingly, a pattern of elderly patients becoming addicted to opioids and then dying from overdoses that generated insurance payments while eliminating witnesses to the prescribing fraud. Baker's mother was 67, close to Maggie Sullivan's age, and the parallel made this investigation intensely personal beyond professional obligation. When the alert came through DEA channels about Margaret Sullivan's assault, Baker's investigative instincts immediately recognized this might be the witness protection failure that his case needed to break through the political barriers that had been preventing warrants against Wolf's organization. He pulled medical records and found connections that made his stomach turn. Maggie Sullivan had filed complaint with Sacramento City Council 14 months ago detailing prescription fraud at Wolf's clinics. Councilman David Price, who sat on the Health Oversight Committee, had promised full investigation. Instead, 3 weeks after Maggie's complaint, her home had been broken into and her computer stolen. 6 weeks after that, she'd been in a minor car accident that police ruled was caused by brake failure, possibly due to tampering. And now, 14 months after her initial complaint, she'd been violently assaulted and her medical files stolen in operation that looked exactly like the 12 previous accidents that had befallen other witnesses to Wolf's fraud. Maggie Sullivan wasn't targeted randomly, Baker told his supervisor during emergency briefing. She's part of systematic witness elimination campaign. Councilman Price is protecting Wolf, and they're using Grey Wolf's cartel as enforcement arm to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose pharmaceutical fraud that's killing elderly patients while generating tens of millions in profits. Councilman David Price received the call from Dr. Adrian Wolf at 4:47 p.m., the pharmaceutical CEO's voice carrying anger that the operation hadn't been as clean as promised. David, your Grey Wolves contacts assaulted Margaret Sullivan in a CVS pharmacy in broad daylight with multiple witnesses and security cameras recording everything. This was supposed to be quiet elimination, staged accident or medical complication that wouldn't attract attention. Instead, you've given me assault captured on video, police investigation, and the victim's son mobilizing Hell's Angels to provide security that makes any follow-up attempt impossible. How exactly does this serve our interest in silencing witnesses before federal investigation gains momentum? Price felt panic rising as he understood that the operation he'd coordinated had failed spectacularly and had potentially exposed his role in protecting Wolf's operations. Adrian, Ramon Castillo, was supposed to stage robbery gone wrong that resulted in fatal injuries appearing accidental. Sullivan fought back. She had medical alert device that her son provided. The situation deteriorated, but the critical objective was achieved. We have her medical files, her documentation of the 47 patient deaths, her correspondence with other healthcare workers. Even if she survives and testifies, we've eliminated the evidence that corroborated her allegations. Wolf's response revealed both his pharmaceutical expertise and his sociopathic willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his profits. David, Margaret Sullivan has been documenting prescription patterns for 14 months. She's shared her findings with at least 35 other healthcare workers, patient family members, and medical professionals. Stealing her physical files doesn't eliminate the information. It just proves that information is valuable enough to commit assault to obtain. We need to eliminate all 35 corroborating witnesses, and we need to do it before the DEA agent who's been investigating me gets protective custody arranged. You have 72 hours to coordinate systematic elimination that appears as natural causes or accidents rather than obvious hits. If you can't deliver that, you become liability that I'll address the same way I've addressed previous liabilities. Danny Nomad Chen sat in the clubhouse at 6 p.m., knowing he'd just enabled an assault on his president's mother, the weight of that betrayal crushing him more than any physical punishment the club might inflict. 8 months ago, Gray Wolves had approached him about his sister Lisa's cancer diagnosis and the experimental treatment that cost $500,000 and wasn't covered by insurance. They'd offered to pay for treatment in exchange for information about Angel's operations, specifically about any elderly family members who might be vulnerable to targeting, their schedules, their security arrangements. Danny had provided Maggie Sullivan's pharmacy pickup schedule while telling himself he was just sharing publicly available information, that surely nobody would actually hurt a 65-year-old hospice nurse. That experimental cancer treatment might save his sister's life, and that possibility justified minor ethical compromises. But watching news coverage of Maggie being wheeled into UC Davis Medical Center, seeing Michael's face as he arrived to find his mother injured, understanding that his information had enabled cartel members to time their assault perfectly, Danny felt guilt consuming him that no rationalization could diminish. The text message that arrived at 6:17 p.m. from his Gray Wolves contacts made the situation exponentially worse. Danny, Sullivan operation partially successful, but complications developed. We need updated information about other elderly Angels family members and the security arrangements being implemented. Provide within 24 hours and we'll release the first $100,000 for Lisa's treatment. Refuse and your sister's care is terminated immediately. You're in too deep to stop cooperating now. Ramon El Lobo Castillo returned to his apartment at 7 p.m. to find his daughter Sofia crying in their living room, the 19-year-old nursing student having just learned through her hospital contacts that one of her mentors and role models had been violently assaulted. "Papa, do you know what happened to Margaret Sullivan?" "She's my preceptor at the hospice clinic. She's been teaching me patient care for 6 months. She's the kindest, most compassionate nurse I've ever met. Someone assaulted her at a pharmacy this afternoon, broke her hip, stole her medical files. The nurses are saying it's related to her exposing pharmaceutical fraud that's been killing elderly patients. Papa, Mrs. Sullivan is 65 years old. She dedicated her life to caring for dying patients. What kind of monster hurts a woman like that?" Ramon felt something break inside his chest as he realized that the elderly hospice nurse he'd assaulted that afternoon, the woman whose medical files he'd stolen and whose hip he'd broken, was the same Margaret Sullivan who'd been mentoring his daughter in nursing school, who Sophia talked about constantly as example of what compassionate healthcare looked like, who'd apparently helped Sophia through a difficult patient death 3 months ago by teaching her how to balance professional distance with genuine empathy. "Sophia, I need to tell you something that's going to destroy how you see me. The woman you're describing, Margaret Sullivan, I'm the one who assaulted her today. I broke her hip. I stole her files. I did it because I was paid to silence a witness to pharmaceutical fraud. I didn't know she was your mentor. I didn't know she was mother of a Hells Angels president. I just knew she was target that someone wanted eliminated. Now I find out I hurt a woman who's been teaching my daughter how to be a good nurse. Sophia, I don't know how to fix what I've broken." Sofia Castillo stared at her father with expression that cycled through disbelief, horror, and finally devastating moral clarity that their relationship could never survive what he'd just confessed. "Papa, Mrs. Sullivan has been teaching me about patient advocacy, about how nurses have obligation to speak up when they see patterns of harm, even when that speech threatens powerful people or institutions. She showed me her documentation about Dr. Wolf's clinics 3 weeks ago, explained how she'd identified systematic overprescribing that was creating opioid addicts and killing elderly patients. She asked me to help verify the pattern through my clinical rotations. Papa, I've been helping her gather evidence about pharmaceutical fraud that's killing people. And you just assaulted her on someone's orders to silence that evidence. You didn't just hurt my mentor. You're part of the conspiracy she's been trying to expose. Ramon felt his carefully compartmentalized life collapsing as he understood that his cartel work hadn't been separate from his family as he'd convinced himself, but had directly intersected with his daughter's education and values in the most devastating way possible. Sophia, I was paid to eliminate a witness. I didn't ask questions about who she was or what she'd done. That's how this work operates. You follow orders, complete objectives, collect payment. But you're right that I'm part of something evil. Dr. Wolf has been using gray wolves to eliminate people who threaten to expose his pharmaceutical fraud. I've participated in 3 of those eliminations over the past year, all elderly people who knew too much about prescription patterns or patient deaths. Mrs. Sullivan is alive because she fought back and because her medical alert brought help quickly. But I'm responsible for her broken hip, her trauma, her stolen evidence, and I don't know how to make that right. Sophia's response came with the moral certainty of someone who'd been taught by Margaret Sullivan about the non-negotiable obligation to protect vulnerable patients. Papa, you make it right by providing testimony that destroys Dr. Wolf's operation and everyone who's been protecting him. You provide evidence about the 3 elderly people you helped eliminate. You document Councilman Price's coordination of these operations. You give prosecutors everything they need to ensure Mrs. Sullivan's assault becomes the catalyst that exposes the entire pharmaceutical fraud network. That doesn't erase what you did, but it means her broken hip and her courage in fighting back weren't wasted. You're going to prison, Papa. You deserve prison. But you can choose whether you go to prison as someone who helped expose systematic patient murder or as someone who died protecting corruption that kills vulnerable people for profit. Michael Axe Sullivan held his mother's hand in her UC Davis Medical Center room at 8 p.m., the 72 hours following hip fracture surgery being critical for elderly patients whose age and underlying health conditions made post-surgical complications more likely. Maggie was stable but weak, her diabetes complicating healing, her age making infection risk significant. Michael, I need you to do something for me, Maggie said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she'd used throughout his childhood when giving instructions she expected him to follow without argument. Dr. Martinez told me about 12 other witnesses who've been killed or intimidated into silence. There are 35 more people who have information about Wolf's fraud, healthcare workers, patient families, medical examiners who've noticed the overdose pattern. They're all at risk right now because Wolf knows his operation has been exposed and he's desperate to eliminate everyone who can testify against him. Michael had been expecting his mother to ask him to avenge her assault, to use club resources to find and punish the men who'd hurt her. Instead, she was asking him to protect 36 vulnerable people who were strangers to him but who shared her commitment to exposing pharmaceutical corruption that was killing patients. Mom, I'm already mobilizing every available brother to provide security for you. You're saying you want me to extend that protection to 35 other people who might be targeted? That's resource commitment that requires coordinating with multiple clubs beyond just Angels. That's not retaliation. That's running protection service for witnesses in pharmaceutical fraud case. Maggie's response revealed why she'd been effective hospice nurse for 37 years. Her ability to focus on patient welfare over personal considerations, her determination to prevent harm even when she'd been harmed herself. Michael, revenge doesn't bring back the 12 people who've already been killed. Revenge doesn't protect the 35 who are at risk right now. But comprehensive protection campaign that makes it impossible for Wolf to eliminate more witnesses, that serves justice and prevents more deaths. I know it's resource intensive. I know it requires coordination across multiple clubs. But son, you have the relationships and the reputation to make it happen. You can save lives by organizing what I'm asking. Avenging my assault just adds to the body count. Preventing future assaults on vulnerable people, That's how you honor what I've spent my life doing. Robert Bishop Hayes convened emergency meeting of chapter officers at 9 p.m. to present the protection campaign that Maggie had requested and that he'd already begun planning before she'd articulated it. Brothers, Maggie Sullivan was targeted as part of systematic campaign to eliminate witnesses to pharmaceutical fraud. We've identified 35 other people who are at similar risk: healthcare workers, patient family members, medical professionals who've documented Dr. Wolf's pattern of overprescribing opioids to elderly patients who then die from overdoses. These are civilians with no involvement in club business, no connection to our operations, just people who did the right thing by reporting medical corruption and are now being systematically eliminated for that witness testimony. Maggie has asked Axe to coordinate protection campaign rather than retaliation campaign. She wants us to prevent future assaults rather than avenging past ones. The response from chapter officers was mixed, some viewing protection of 36 civilians as mission creep beyond the club's core functions, others recognizing that Maggie's request represented exactly the kind of community service that distinguished Angels from purely criminal organizations. Marcus Chainsaw Williams, Sergeant-at-Arms, articulated the pragmatic concern. Bishop, we're talking about providing 24/7 security for 35 people scattered across Sacramento County. That requires minimum 105 brothers on rotating shifts if we're doing 3-man teams around the clock. We have maybe 200 active members in Sacramento chapter. This protection campaign would consume half our available manpower for however long it takes to get these witnesses through testimony and prosecution. What happens to our other obligations? Security contracts, business operations, territory management? Robert's response revealed both his personal commitment to elder protection and his tactical understanding of how this campaign could serve multiple strategic objectives. Chainsaw, you're right that this is massive resource commitment. That's why we're not doing it alone. I've already contacted Mongols, Bandidos, Outlaws, and Vagos. Every club president I've spoken with has elderly family members who could be targeted the same way Maggie was. They recognize that pharmaceutical fraud killing vulnerable patients while using organized crime to silence witnesses, that's threat to all our communities regardless of club affiliation. They're committing members to coordinate protection campaign. We're looking at 1,500 bikers from 5 organizations providing comprehensive security that makes eliminating these witnesses functionally impossible. That's not just protection. That's visible demonstration that touching vulnerable people who speak truth about corruption unites us in ways that territory disputes never could. Agent Tom Baker coordinated emergency meeting with DEA leadership and Sacramento FBI office at 10 p.m., his presentation making clear that Margaret Sullivan's assault represented critical opportunity to break through political barriers that had been protecting Dr. Wolf's operations for 3 years. Maggie Sullivan documented 47 elderly patient deaths from opioid overdoses prescribed through Wolf's clinics. She filed complaint with City Council 14 months ago. Instead of investigation, she's been systematically targeted: home invasion, vehicle tampering, and now violent assault with evidence theft. This follows pattern we've identified with 12 previous witnesses who were killed or intimidated into silence. Councilman David Price coordinated these eliminations while claiming to investigate Maggie's complaints. And Grey Wolf's cartel is being used as enforcement arm for pharmaceutical CEO who's generating tens of millions in profits while killing vulnerable patients. The FBI special agent in charge raised the obvious concern. Agent Baker, you're describing coordination between pharmaceutical executive, city councilman, and cartel. That's conspiracy spanning multiple jurisdictions and criminal enterprises. What evidence do we have beyond circumstantial pattern that these entities are actually working together? Baker pulled up comprehensive files that he'd been building for 2 years. Shell corporations connecting Wolf's pharmaceutical company to accounts that paid Councilman Price, communications between Price's office and Grey Wolf's intermediaries, financial records showing payments coinciding with witness eliminations, And most recently, pharmacy security footage showing Ramon Castillo assaulting Maggie Sullivan specifically to steal her medical files rather than commit standard robbery. We have everything except insider testimony from someone who participated in the conspiracy, which is why I've been trying to coordinate protective custody for potential witnesses before they're all eliminated. The tactical challenge Baker described was daunting. 35 witnesses scattered across Sacramento County, insufficient federal marshals to provide comprehensive protection, no safe houses available that could accommodate multiple elderly people with medical needs, and timeline measured in hours before Dr. Wolf's people made coordinated attempt to eliminate remaining witnesses before they could be secured. We can maybe protect 6 high-value witnesses in federal custody, Baker acknowledged. We can't protect 35 civilians with the resources available in this timeline. Which is where the motorcycle clubs come in. Michael Sullivan has coordinated commitment from 5 organizations to provide street-level protection that federal agencies can't match. They're offering 1,500 bikers doing 24/7 security for all 35 witnesses. It's irregular, it's outside normal protocols, but it might be the only thing that prevents massacre of elderly healthcare workers and patient families over the next 72 hours. Dr. Adrian Wolf reviewed the updated witness list at 11 p.m., with growing understanding that his operation was collapsing and that elimination of all 35 corroborating witnesses would require resources and coordination beyond what Grey Wolves could deliver in compressed timeline. David, I need you to understand what we're facing, Wolf told Councilman Price during encrypted call. Margaret Sullivan shared her findings with 35 other people. Each of those people has partial information about my prescription patterns, patient deaths, billing fraud. Individually, their testimony is circumstantial. Collectively, they create overwhelming case that my clinics have been systematically overprescribing opioids to elderly patients, creating addictions that generate ongoing revenue, and then allowing or facilitating overdoses that eliminate witnesses while generating insurance payouts. If even half of those 35 witnesses survive to testify, I'm facing multiple life sentences for medical fraud, racketeering, and probably murder charges. Price processed this with desperation of someone who'd tied his political future to Wolf's pharmaceutical profits and was now watching both collapse simultaneously. Adrian, the DEA agent investigating you has identified the pattern. FBI is coordinating with local law enforcement. And Michael Sullivan has mobilized multiple motorcycle clubs to provide protection for the witnesses. We can't eliminate 35 people who are under Angel's protection without triggering war that destroys everyone involved. Our only option is eliminating the high-value witnesses who have the most comprehensive evidence: Margaret Sullivan, Dr. Elena Martinez, and maybe 3 others whose testimony would be impossible to discredit. 5 coordinated eliminations in 72 hours, staged as medical complications or accidents before federal protective custody can be arranged. What neither Wolf nor Price understood was that their encrypted communication was being monitored by Agent Baker's team through warrant that had been obtained 18 months ago, but had been sitting unused due to political pressure from officials connected to Wolf's lobbying operations. Every word of their conspiracy discussion was being recorded, documented, and would later be used as evidence of coordinated witness elimination campaign. Adrian, you just confessed to planning multiple murders on a call that federal agents are probably monitoring, Price said, his political survival instincts finally overriding his commitment to protecting Wolf's operations. I can't be part of this anymore. I can't coordinate eliminations of elderly healthcare workers. I'm done. Wolf's response revealed both his pharmaceutical fortune and his sociopathic calculus about human life. David, you're done when I say you're done. You've accepted $2.3 million in payments over 3 years to provide political protection and coordinate witness elimination. You're as complicit as I am in every death, every assault, every crime we've committed. If you attempt to distance yourself, if you try to cooperate with federal investigation, you become liability that I'll address the same way I've addressed previous liabilities. You have one choice: Help me eliminate the 5 high-value witnesses or accept that you'll be number 6. Danny Nomad Chen walked into Michael Sullivan's hospital room at midnight with confession that would either get him killed immediately or provide the intelligence breakthrough that would expose the entire pharmaceutical conspiracy. Axe, I need to tell you something that's going to make you want to execute me in this hospital. 8 months ago, Grey Wolves approached me about my sister Lisa's cancer. They offered to pay for experimental treatment that costs $500,000. In exchange, they wanted information about Angel's operations and family vulnerabilities. I provided your mother's pharmacy schedule. I enabled them to time the assault perfectly. I betrayed Maggie because I couldn't watch my sister die from cancer we couldn't afford to treat. I'm guilty of everything you're thinking. But before you kill me, I can give you something. Grey Wolves are planning coordinated assault on 5 high-value witnesses, including your mother, within 72 hours. They're trying to eliminate everyone who can testify about Dr. Wolf's pharmaceutical fraud. I have communications, payment records, targeting information, everything you need to prevent those eliminations and expose everyone involved. The silence that followed Danny's confession lasted 11 seconds before Maggie spoke from her hospital bed, her voice weak but carrying the moral authority of someone who'd spent lifetime making impossible ethical decisions. Michael, don't kill him. Not yet. Danny betrayed us because he was coerced through his sister's illness. That's evil manipulation of family loyalty. But he's offering intelligence that can save lives and expose corruption. Let him provide everything he knows. Let him help prevent the 5 planned eliminations. And then, Michael, you decide whether betrayal motivated by trying to save a sister deserves execution or exile. But make that decision after we've used his information to protect the vulnerable people who are about to be targeted. Michael stared at the prospect who'd enabled his mother's assault, his instincts screaming for immediate violence, his tactical mind recognizing that Danny's intelligence about planned eliminations was exactly what they needed to shift from reactive protection to proactive prevention. Danny, you enabled an assault that broke my mother's hip and could have killed her. The fact that you were coerced through Lisa's cancer doesn't erase what you did. But Mom's right that your information might prevent 5 more people from being hurt or killed. Here's what happens. You provide everything you know. You wear federal wire and document communications with Grey Wolves. You help Agent Baker build case against Wolf and Price. And then Danny, you're out bad forever. You never wear the patch. You never contact any brother again. You live with guilt of knowing you betrayed us, even if we're allowing you to survive that betrayal because your mother asked for mercy you don't deserve. The coordinated protection deployment began at 2 a.m. with 1,500 bikers from 5 organizations positioning themselves around the homes, workplaces, and medical facilities where the 35 identified witnesses lived or worked. The formations were comprehensive and visible. 3-man teams at each location, rotating 8-hour shifts, communication networks coordinating movements and threat responses. The visual impact was overwhelming. Motorcycles lining residential streets, bikers stationed outside hospitals and clinics, coordinated presence that made it clear these witnesses were under protection that would require military assault to penetrate. News helicopters captured aerial footage of the deployment that would dominate regional coverage for days. Angels, Mongols, Bandidos, Outlaws, and Vagos working together in unprecedented display of coordination that transcended traditional rivalries. Robert Bishop Hayes coordinated the tactical deployment from command post at UC Davis Medical Center, where Maggie remained hospitalized, his paramedic background and tactical experience making him ideal coordinator for operation that combined security with medical vulnerability. Brothers, we're not just protecting witnesses. We're protecting elderly and medically vulnerable people who need ongoing healthcare access. That means our security can't prevent them from getting to dialysis appointments, chemotherapy sessions, cardiac follow-ups. We need to provide armed escort services, coordinate with healthcare facilities to ensure our presence doesn't disrupt patient care, and maintain protection that's comprehensive without being oppressive. This isn't traditional security. It's healthcare support with defensive capability. Sophia Castillo arrived at Maggie Sullivan's hospital room at 3 a.m. with comprehensive documentation that her father Ramon had provided. Recordings of conversations with Councilman Price, text messages coordinating witness eliminations, financial records showing payments from accounts traced to Dr. Wolf's pharmaceutical empire, and, most damningly, the list of 5 high-value witnesses targeted for elimination within 72 hours. Mrs. Sullivan, my father is the man who assaulted you. I've spent the past 6 hours convincing him that redemption requires destroying the people who hired him rather than continuing to protect them. He's provided everything, 3 years of coordination between Grey Wolves, Councilman Price, and Dr. Wolf. 12 previous witness eliminations. Systematic pharmaceutical fraud killing elderly patients. And the immediate plan to kill you, Dr. Martinez, and 3 other witnesses before federal protection can be arranged. Papa is guilty. He deserves prison. But he wants his cooperation to prevent more deaths and expose the corruption you've been fighting. Maggie looked at the young nursing student she'd been mentoring, understanding the devastating choice Sophia had made between protecting her father and protecting the vulnerable patients they'd both committed to serving. Sophia, your father broke my hip and stole my medical files. He participated in murders of 12 other elderly people. The fact that he's now cooperating doesn't erase those crimes, but his information can prevent 5 more deaths and expose systematic pharmaceutical fraud. That's justice, even if it's incomplete. Tell your father I accept his cooperation while not forgiving his crimes. Tell him that teaching my student about patient advocacy matters more than personal vengeance. And Sophia, you keep coming to your clinical rotations. You keep learning to be the kind of nurse who speaks truth even when powerful people want silence. That's how you honor the victims, by being better than the systems that failed them. Agent Tom Baker executed coordinated arrests at 6:47 a.m. with tactical teams hitting multiple locations simultaneously. Councilman David Price arrested at his home, 3 Grey Wolves lieutenants arrested at their residences, and 6 pharmaceutical executives arrested at Dr. Wolf's corporate headquarters. The charges were comprehensive. Conspiracy to commit murder, 17 counts including 12 completed and 5 planned. Pharmaceutical fraud, racketeering, corruption, and obstruction of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Ramon Castillo's testimony about 3 years of witness elimination, Danny Chen's communications documenting the targeting coordination, financial records showing millions in payments from Wolf to Price to Grey Wolves, and recordings of Price and Wolf discussing plans to eliminate the 5 high-value witnesses. This is systematic conspiracy to murder elderly witnesses to pharmaceutical fraud, Baker announced during press conference. Dr. Wolf's clinics were deliberately overprescribing opioids to vulnerable patients, creating addictions that generated ongoing revenue and then eliminating witnesses who identified the pattern. 12 people are dead. Margaret Sullivan nearly became number 13, but her courage in fighting back and her son's coordination of unprecedented witness protection campaign exposed the entire operation. Dr. Adrian Wolf was found dead in his home office at 8:34 a.m., approximately 90 minutes after learning about Price's arrest and minutes before federal agents arrived to execute warrant for his custody. His suicide note was comprehensive confession that detailed 15 years of pharmaceutical fraud, including the systematic overprescribing scheme that had killed at least 47 elderly patients. I built a fortune by creating addicts and then allowing them to overdose once they'd generated sufficient insurance revenue. I used Grey Wolves Cartel to eliminate healthcare workers and patient families who identified the pattern. I corrupted city councilmen to provide political protection. I'm responsible for at least 60 deaths, the 47 patients Margaret Sullivan documented, plus 12 witnesses who were eliminated to protect my operation, plus Rachel Wolf, my wife who discovered my fraud 5 years ago and died in car accident that I arranged. I can't undo what I've done, but maybe my death and this confession prevent others from following my path. Pharmaceutical executives are supposed to heal people. I killed them for profit. The second wave of attacks on the protected witnesses came 36 hours after Dr. Wolf's suicide, executed not by gray wolves following official orders, but by desperate remnants of the pharmaceutical conspiracy who understood that eliminating key witnesses represented their only chance to undermine federal prosecution. 6 hired contractors attempted coordinated assaults on 3 locations simultaneously: Margaret Sullivan's hospital room, Dr. Elena Martinez's medical office, and the home of Patricia Chen, a medical examiner who documented the suspicious overdose pattern. What the attackers hadn't anticipated was that Robert Bishop Hayes had positioned himself at Maggie's hospital specifically because his tactical analysis suggested she remained the highest value target, that his paramedic background had taught him to read medical facilities' security vulnerabilities, and that he'd spent 2 days preparing defensive positions that would channel any assault into kill zones where defenders held overwhelming advantage. The breach attempt at UC Davis Medical Center began at 2:47 a.m. when 3 contractors entered through emergency department access using stolen hospital credentials, their weapons concealed, their movements suggesting professional military training beyond typical hired muscle. Robert was positioned in the hallway outside Maggie's room with 2 other angels, his defensive formation designed to protect the narrow corridor approach while maintaining clear fields of fire that wouldn't endanger hospital staff or patients. "Contact! 3 tangos approaching from the east stairwell," Robert transmitted through his radio network, alerting the other protection teams throughout the hospital. "They're armed, moving with tactical coordination, definitely professionals rather than standard cartel sicarios. All teams, weapons hot. But remember, we're in a hospital with civilians everywhere. Precision only. No spray and pray." The first contractor rounded the corner at 2:49 a.m. with his weapon already drawn, his tactical error being that he'd assumed hospital security would be standard rent-a-cops rather than ex-paramedic who'd spent 6 years responding to violent trauma calls and had learned to read aggressive movement patterns before weapons were visible. Robert's first shot hit the contractor center mass before the man could acquire his target, the suppressed round dropping him immediately. The second contractor attempted to use his fallen associate as cover while engaging Robert's position, but the Angels' crossfire from flanking positions eliminated that advantage within 3 seconds. The third contractor recognized the tactical impossibility of his situation and attempted to flee back through the stairwell, but Robert's pursuit and final shot ensured he didn't escape to threaten other witnesses or return with reinforcements. The simultaneous assault on Dr. Elena Martinez's medical office was repelled by Mongol's protection team using similar tactics, their defensive preparation and tactical coordination resulting in 3 more contractors dead without any injuries to the protected witness or civilian casualties. But the attack on Patricia Chen's home encountered complications that Robert's worst-case planning had anticipated but hoped to prevent. Patricia's grandson, Tommy, age 12, was staying with her during school break, his presence meaning that defensive response had to account for child in the home who could be used as hostage or could be accidentally injured during firefight. The Outlaws team protecting Patricia's residence found themselves in a situation where a contractor had managed to grab Tommy before being neutralized, the standoff lasting 17 minutes and ending only when Robert arrived and used his paramedic training to talk the contractor into releasing the boy by offering medical treatment for a gunshot wound that was causing rapid blood loss. "You're bleeding out from femoral artery damage," Robert told the contractor with clinical calm that came from treating hundreds of trauma patients. "You have maybe 20 minutes before you lose consciousness from blood loss, maybe 40 before you die without surgical intervention. Release the boy, accept medical treatment, and you survive this. Keep holding him and you bleed out while we wait, and the kid still survives because we're not leaving until you're dead or in custody. You're making emotional decision when you need to make tactical one. Living in prison is better than dying in this hallway." The contractor released Tommy at the 19-minute mark, his tactical training overriding his desperation when he recognized Robert was right about the blood loss timeline. Robert applied emergency tourniquet and pressure dressing while Angels secured the scene, his paramedic instincts to preserve life competing with his fury at someone who'd tried to kill elderly medical examiner and had used a child as human shield. The contractor died during ambulance transport despite Robert's medical intervention, his femoral damage too severe to survive the time between injury and hospital arrival. Robert stood in Patricia Chen's driveway at 4:17 a.m. covered in the man's blood, his hands shaking from adrenaline come-down, his mind processing that he'd just spent 17 minutes trying to save the life of someone who'd been attempting to murder a grandmother and had used her grandson as hostage. "Bishop, you did everything right," Michael told his vice president when he arrived at the scene. "You protected Patricia. You saved Tommy from being injured or traumatized worse than witnessing this. You tried to preserve life even when the person didn't deserve that effort. That's who you are, paramedic first, enforcer second, always trying to save people even when they're trying to kill the people you're protecting." Robert's response revealed the psychological toll of 6 years of paramedic work followed by 22 years of club life that sometimes required violence he'd spent his medical career trying to prevent. "Axe, I joined Angels after I burned out on emergency medicine. I got tired of seeing people die from preventable causes, overdoses, assaults, accidents that proper prevention could have avoided. I thought club life would be simpler, protecting brothers, managing threats, using violence when necessary but in service of loyalty and family. But tonight, I protected a grandmother and child from hired killers, tried to save the life of one of those killers because my medical training won't let me watch someone bleed out, and I'm standing here realizing that the violence I've been trying to prevent just keeps finding different forms." Wolf killed 47 elderly patients for profit. His hired contractors tried to kill 12 more to cover up those crimes. And I'm covered in blood of someone who died because pharmaceutical executive valued money over lives. Michael held his friend and vice president while Robert processed the trauma, understanding that Bishop's commitment to protecting vulnerable community members came from deeply personal place that tonight's violence had reopened. "Brother, your mother died from medical neglect because systems that should have protected her were understaffed and underfunded. You became paramedic to prevent those deaths. You joined Angels because you needed brotherhood after burning out. And tonight, you prevented pharmaceutical conspiracy from claiming more victims, including a 12-year-old boy who would have been traumatized or killed if you hadn't been here. That's not failure. That's exactly the purpose you've been serving. Your medical training saved Tommy's life by talking down someone who was using him as shield. Your tactical preparation saved Patricia's life by positioning teams that could respond to coordinated assault. You're exhausted and covered in blood and questioning everything, but, Bishop, you did what Mom asked us to do. You protected vulnerable witnesses rather than just avenging her assault. The investigation of the 6 contractors revealed final layer of conspiracy that made Agent Baker's case even more comprehensive. All 6 were former military or law enforcement. All had been hired through security company that pharmaceutical industry used for corporate risk management, and all had communications on their phones discussing executive protection services that were actually coordinated witness elimination. The security company's CEO was arrested within 8 hours, his records providing evidence of 17 previous protection contracts that had resulted in convenient deaths of whistleblowers, witnesses, and corporate threats across multiple industries. "This isn't just pharmaceutical fraud," Baker explained during expanded briefing with FBI, DEA, and state prosecutors. "This is systematic witness elimination industry that serves corporate interests across healthcare, finance, and government contracting. Dr. Wolf's operation is one client among many. The 1,500 bikers protecting Margaret Sullivan's witnesses disrupted business model that has been operating with near impunity for at least a decade." Councilman David Price was found dead in his jail cell 3 days before his scheduled testimony. The official cause of death ruled suicide by hanging, though circumstances suggested possibilities that investigators couldn't definitively prove or disprove. His suicide note confessed to 3 years of accepting payments from Dr. Wolf in exchange for blocking investigations and coordinating witness elimination. I accepted $2.3 million to protect pharmaceutical fraud that killed vulnerable patients. I coordinated attacks on elderly healthcare workers and patient families who tried to expose systematic overprescribing. I'm responsible for 12 deaths, including Margaret Sullivan's near death. I convinced myself that pharmaceutical profits generated tax revenue that served public good, that eliminating troublesome witnesses was pragmatic governance rather than murder conspiracy. I was wrong. The people I helped kill deserved protection, not elimination. I can't undo what I've done, but maybe my death and this confession prevent other public officials from selling their integrity for corporate money. Ramon El Lobo Castillo pled guilty to assault, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering charges, his cooperation with federal prosecutors earning him reduced sentence of 25 years with eligibility for parole after serving 17. His testimony was instrumental in convicting 8 corrupt officials, dismantling Grey Wolf's witness elimination operations, and documenting how pharmaceutical companies used organized crime as enforcement arm while maintaining corporate respectability. I assaulted Margaret Sullivan because I was paid to eliminate a witness to pharmaceutical fraud, Ramon said during his sentencing hearing. I broke her hip. I stole her medical files. I participated in this knowing she was elderly hospice nurse who'd dedicated her life to patient care. The fact that she turned out to be my daughter's mentor, that Sophia had been learning patient advocacy from the woman I'd been hired to silence, that doesn't change my guilt, but it forces me to confront exactly who I hurt and why. Mrs. Sullivan fought back against me and 3 other men. She hospitalized 2 of us before we overwhelmed her. That courage exposed corruption that had been killing patients for years. I deserve 25 years for what I did, but I'm grateful my cooperation helped prevent 5 more elderly people from being murdered and exposed the conspiracy that made my crimes possible. Sophia Castillo continued her nursing education while maintaining contact with Margaret Sullivan through clinical rotations and mentorship that had survived the revelation about Ramon's role in Maggie's assault. Their relationship was complicated but defined by shared commitment to patient advocacy that transcended personal trauma. Mrs. Sullivan taught me that nurses have obligation to speak truth about patterns of harm even when that truth threatens powerful interests, Sophia explained during interview about healthcare ethics and whistleblower protection. My father assaulted her to silence that truth-telling. But Mrs. Sullivan's response wasn't revenge. It was insisting that her assault become catalyst for exposing pharmaceutical fraud and protecting other vulnerable witnesses. That's the nursing I want to practice. Advocacy that serves patient welfare over institutional comfort, courage that persists despite personal cost, commitment to preventing harm rather than just treating consequences. Margaret Sullivan was discharged from UC Davis Medical Center 6 weeks after her assault. Her hip fracture healed but mobility permanently reduced, her age and diabetes complicating recovery in ways that meant she'd never return to full pre-assault function. The 1,500 biker protection campaign continued for 3 months until all 35 witnesses had provided comprehensive testimony and federal prosecutors had secured convictions or cooperation agreements from everyone involved in the pharmaceutical conspiracy. I asked Michael to protect people rather than avenge me, Maggie said during interview with Sacramento Bee about the unprecedented witness protection campaign. 1,500 bikers from 5 organizations provided security that prevented 5 planned murders and enabled testimony that convicted 17 people, including city councilmen, pharmaceutical executives, and organized crime members. That's not the motorcycle club stereotype of violence and chaos. That's disciplined community protection that achieved more than traditional law enforcement could have managed with available resources. The Multi-Club Protection Alliance maintained operational coordination for 18 months following the pharmaceutical fraud prosecution. The 5 organizations that had worked together establishing protocols for responding to elder abuse. creating intelligence-sharing networks that identified predatory schemes targeting vulnerable populations, and demonstrating that clubs with decades of rivalry could prioritize community protection over territorial conflicts when circumstances demanded it. The alliance eventually transitioned from active operations to standby coordination framework, but the precedent remained. Proof that unity was possible when protecting vulnerable people mattered more than maintaining traditional antagonisms, when family protection transcended club identity, when the alternative to cooperation was allowing systematic abuse to continue unopposed. Michael Axe Sullivan stepped down as Sacramento chapter president 5 years after his mother's assault. His leadership legacy defined not by territorial expansion or criminal enterprise, but by demonstrating that 1,500 bikers could provide witness protection that exposed pharmaceutical conspiracy killing vulnerable patients while corrupt officials looked away. I joined Hell's Angels because I wanted brotherhood and purpose beyond the construction work that paid my bills, Michael said during his retirement speech to assembled members. I'm leaving chapter presidency because my mother's assault taught me that purpose is measured in protecting people who can't protect themselves, in organizing resources that serve community welfare, in building alliances that transcend traditional rivalries when protecting the vulnerable requires unprecedented cooperation. We coordinated 5 clubs, deployed 1,500 bikers for 3 months, prevented 5 murders, and enabled prosecution that convicted 17 people for systematic pharmaceutical fraud. That's what the patch means. Not the outlaw reputation, but the commitment to being there when vulnerable people need protection that institutions can't or won't provide. Danny Nomad Chen left California 3 days after Lisa's death, his exile from the Angels meaning he could never return to the state or contact any brother again. His cooperation with Agent Baker, providing Grey Wolves communications, wearing federal wire, revealing targeting information that prevented the 5 planned murders, had contributed to successful prosecution. But his initial betrayal in providing Maggie's schedule had enabled the assault that started everything, and that betrayal earned permanent exile rather than execution only because Maggie had asked Michael to show mercy that Danny hadn't earned. Danny, your sister is dead despite the $500,000 treatment that Grey Wolves promised because that treatment was always a lie designed to manipulate you, Michael had told him during their final meeting. You betrayed my mother for nothing, but your subsequent cooperation helped save 5 lives and expose pharmaceutical conspiracy. You're alive because Mom asked for mercy you don't deserve. You're exiled because betrayal can never be forgiven, even if it's being allowed to be survived. Leave California. Never contact any angel again. And every day remember that Lisa died from cancer that was real while the treatment they promised was fantasy designed to exploit your desperation. Lisa Chen had died from stage 4 pancreatic cancer 8 days after being rescued from Grey Wolves' custody where she'd been held as leverage against Danny's cooperation, her body too damaged by 8 months without proper medical care to survive, even with the aggressive treatment that real oncologists provided once she entered legitimate health care. Danny buried his sister in Nevada under a name that wasn't theirs. The funeral attended only by Danny and a priest who'd never met Lisa, but understood that terminal illness destroyed families in ways that sometimes couldn't be repaired, even when intervention came. Lisa died because I tried to save her through betrayal instead of asking my club for help with medical costs they probably would have assisted with, Danny wrote in letter to Michael that he sent but never expected response to. I traded my brother's trust for false promise of treatment. I enabled assault on Maggie that could have killed her, and I lost everything. My sister, my club, my honor. I'm sorry isn't enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have left to offer. Robert Bishop Hayes died 7 months after the final contractor assault, killed not in dramatic confrontation, but in the quietest and most devastating way. Heart attack while teaching CPR class at Sacramento Community Center where he'd been volunteering since stepping back from active club duties. He was 52 years old, had survived 2 decades of emergency medicine, and 22 years of club life, and died doing what he'd spent his adult life doing, teaching people how to save lives. Bishop dedicated his existence to protecting vulnerable people and preserving life even in situations where violence seemed inevitable, Michael said during the funeral that drew 25,000 people, including paramedics from Robert's EMS years, bikers from 6 different clubs, and dozens of elderly community members whose lives Bishop had protected during the pharmaceutical fraud witness campaign. He lost his mother to medical neglect, spent 6 years as paramedic trying to prevent similar deaths, joined Angels because he needed brotherhood after burning out, and spent 2 decades using his medical training and tactical expertise to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Michael paused, looking across the massive gathering. Bishop died teaching CPR, showing community members how to respond to cardiac emergencies, giving them skills that might save their families or neighbors. That's how he lived, always trying to prevent death, always positioning himself between vulnerable people and threats, always believing that protection mattered more than punishment. He protected my mother when pharmaceutical conspiracy tried to eliminate her. He coordinated 1,500 biker witness campaign that prevented 5 murders. He talked down contractor holding child hostage by offering medical treatment rather than escalating violence. And he died teaching life-saving skills to people who'll never know how many lives Bishop saved during his career. Most people don't get that. They die without clear legacy. Bishop's legacy is everyone he protected, everyone he taught, everyone who survived because he was willing to stand between them and harm. The funeral procession stretched for 11 miles, the motorcycle escort including representatives from organizations that had participated in the witness protection campaign and new clubs that had heard about Bishop's commitment to elder protection. They rode past UC Davis Medical Center where Maggie had been treated, past the Sacramento Community Center where Bishop had taught his final CPR class, and finally to the cemetery where he was buried beside his mother, whose death from medical neglect had defined his adult mission. Maggie Sullivan attended despite her limited mobility, her presence honoring the man who'd protected her and the 35 other witnesses whose testimony had exposed pharmaceutical conspiracy that had killed 47 vulnerable patients. 8 years after her assault and the witness protection campaign that followed, Margaret Sullivan celebrated her 73rd birthday, surrounded by the 35 witnesses whose lives had been saved by the coordinated multi-club protection operation, by Sophia Castillo, who'd graduated nursing school and was working in hospice care following Maggie's example, and by Michael, who'd built legitimate business empire while maintaining Angels membership without holding leadership position. "I'm grateful to be alive," Maggie said during the celebration at the community center where Bishop had taught his final class. "I'm grateful that 47 patients whose deaths I documented led to prosecution that convicted pharmaceutical executives and corrupt officials. I'm grateful that 1,500 bikers coordinated protection campaign that prevented 5 more murders and enabled testimony that exposed systematic fraud. But mostly, I'm grateful for Robert Hayes, who died teaching people how to save lives, who spent 2 decades protecting vulnerable community members, who believed that preservation of life mattered more than punishment of wrongdoing. Bishop's death wasn't waste, it was continuation of mission he'd dedicated his life to after his mother's death. Every person he protected, every life he saved, every CPR student who goes on to save someone else. That's Bishop's legacy. Their story serves as a reminder that pharmaceutical fraud can kill vulnerable patients while hiding behind corporate respectability, that corrupt officials will facilitate systematic abuse when corporate money is involved, and that sometimes protecting witnesses requires community mobilization rather than relying on institutions that have been compromised. Dr. Wolf thought he could eliminate elderly witnesses who threatened to expose his opioid prescription fraud. Councilman Price thought he could coordinate those eliminations while hiding behind his elected position. Both learned that assaulting one retired hospice nurse whose son happened to be motorcycle club president triggered protection campaign that made continuing witness elimination impossible. That 1,500 bikers could provide security that federal agencies couldn't match with available resources, and that communities organizing to protect their most vulnerable members could accomplish what traditional law enforcement had failed to prioritize, despite years of evidence. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring pharmaceutical corruption, elder protection, and the extraordinary things communities do when protecting vulnerable people requires unprecedented cooperation. Share this with someone who needs to understand that systematic abuse of vulnerable patients requires systematic protection response, that elderly healthcare workers deserve security when they speak truth about corruption, and that sometimes the most effective response to institutional failure is community mobilization that makes continuing that failure practically impossible. Margaret Sullivan was assaulted to silence her testimony about pharmaceutical fraud. She survived and insisted on protection for 35 other witnesses rather than revenge. Robert Hayes died protecting those witnesses and teaching life-saving skills. And the combination, corporate corruption and community response, elder abuse and unprecedented multi-club coordination, witness protection and systematic prosecution, defines the world where protecting vulnerable people requires choosing cooperation over conflict, prevention over punishment, and service over vengeance when institutions designed to provide that protection have been completely compromised by the interests they're supposed to regulate.